Yeah, I think we're at a point at which we were discussing A.B. Guma becoming, the president of the ANC in 1940. But I also mentioned the fact that, Guma was a protege of Booker T. Washington. And, just in terms of their approach to the struggle, there are some fundamental differences between Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey. And the point that I made earlier was that Marcus Garvey would be considered a more radical, as having been more radical than Booker T. Washington would have been. But I think just to give a balanced view, of what the relationship would have been between Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey, because then this becomes important for, our understanding of A.B. Guma as ANC president. And Dadamlara, do you want to?
Maybe a little clarification first. I think by the time Guma got to the States, Booker T was already gone.
Yes.
It's a success of his name escapes me.
Yeah.
But it's noteworthy here to be emphatic. A.B. Guma did go to Tuskegee.
Yes.
With some of his education at Tuskegee School. As did many other black South Africans, indeed in the early 20th century, as a condition of the fact that tertiary education was closed to black people in South Africa. So it became crucial for black people who had aspirations, beyond high school or so forth, or teachers training college, to venture forth overseas. Many of them went over, and there's a whole history here, and A.B. Guma is merely one of them.
Yeah.
You wanted me to clarify this matter of...
Because part of what we are looking at here is that there was a certain radical character about Marcus Garvey that one does not actually find in Booker T. Washington.
It first bears noting that the very reason why Marcus Garvey came to the United States was to meet Booker T. Washington.
Yes.
So Marcus Garvey had come to solicit Booker T. Washington's help to build an institution, just like Tuskegee in Jamaica. Yeah. Of course, somebody else here in South Africa would do the same. I mean,
Dube did that, yes.
Institute. You see, so the example of Booker T. Washington in segregation, post-bellum, that means after the Civil War, Jim Crow era America, lay in the fact that he put forth a stratagem for independent black survival within the constraints of white society. So his program, was very, slanted towards the establishment of black manned and black operated how shall I say, black directed institutions.
Yeah.
You see, and in this regard, he, bargained with white society where he could to be able to establish it. So Booker T. Washington didn't really handle the question of black sovereignty.
Yeah.
He studiously avoided it, and for that very reason, he is perceived as conservative. You see, by much scholarly opinion.
Yes,
Other people, of course, from a black nationalist orientation would beg to differ on that very issue.
Yes, but it is when compared to Marcus Garvey that this sense of him
who then advances the Booker T program, inherits the Booker T program of independent self-development, puts it forth to sovereignty, to directly tackle the matter of sovereignty on a global level. In his insistence that black people will not be free, nor will be worthy of anybody else's respect until they build a powerful entity on their own somewhere on earth. That means a state entity capable of protecting and advancing their interests. You see, within the segregationist colonialist era of the time. So this is it. So I don't know if
I think that actually, because it helps. I mean, part of what we are trying to work out here would be the organizational and structural differences, between the ANC and what becomes a radical paradigm in South Africa. So Guma, when he comes in, no doubt, he's being, in the same terms as Ndatemolora is explaining, he is being characterized as a radical of sorts. And this is why, in historiography, it is Uma's intervention that is explained as, driving ANC towards the masses and therefore towards, a radical position. But it is important for us to understand, at what point this historical narrative is being constructed and where actually it is being constructed. We are not here talking about, reflections in the political landscape. We are talking about, how this narrative was actually constructed in lecture theaters, in universities. It is interesting, that a great deal of this actually happens post Black Wednesday, which is why Black Wednesday is important for us to understand. And if we understand, Black Wednesday and its significance, in the Black radical tradition, of the 20th century, then we can be able to understand how, historically, there had been a kind of white left, and this is how we characterize it. What intervenes in the lecture theaters is a whole generation of academics. And these are academics that are inclined towards what in South Africa we refer to as the white radical left. And we have to explain where the white radical left actually comes from. There had always been, the influence of white radicals, of the SACP, inside the ANC, from the Congress Alliance in 1953. The Africanists came away from the ANC precisely because of their dissatisfaction, with white radicals, but in particular, with those that were Marxist, Leninist inclined.
I'd like to ask a question there now.
Yes.
Because, as we are surviving now, we see this anti-communist from the white community. It's a swear word for them. Once they call you a communist, it's the biggest swear word. So what is that coming from? And why would white people be against white radicalism? What is it that is frightening them?
We have to put this into a historical context. And I think, we were coming close to, looking at the 1950s and actually conceding that the 1950s was a decade of the mass movement. There is no doubt about that. But the issue here is that until post-1977, there was no academic reflection on the 1950s as a decade of mass mobilization. This is a narrative that gets constructed post-Black Wednesday. And there's a reason for that. You would expect that, in the early 1980s, what should be taught in the universities, what should be central, is the most recent, kind of political development inside South Africa. But if they did that, then there would have been a greater focus, on the black mass movement of the 1970s, in which case, university history and historiography would have been forced to deal with the 1970s movement as a black radical movement. So the idea here is to deflect that and actually go back to the 1950s and start reconstructing the history of the 1950s in such a way that the ANC appears to be a mass movement in the 1950s. We have just made a few concessions. We have said that Guma introduces a radical element into the ANC by opening up the ANC to certain segments of society. We singled out the women and the youth. And that in itself begins to broaden the ANC's support base. And therefore it gives it, a sense of becoming, a kind of a mass movement at the same time, But the mass movement of the 1950s is inevitably a radical movement, because the ANC was an elitist middle-class movement which prevented it, from responding, to underclass concerns, for lack of a better word. But by Guma coming onto the picture, you are beginning to see the movement actually opening up. But, and this is an important, rider here that one has, that I'm adding here. The issue is that the Youth League itself, when created, it already has a paradigm. It already has an ideological predisposition. And that predisposition is, in fact, Africanist. And that's what the Youth League is. We know that there are notable members of the Youth League, Anton Lembede, Robert Sobukwe, Eshpim Da, and these are known to be Africanists. But they are part of the Youth League, between 1944 and 1958. In that 15-year period, they are part of the ANC Youth League. So it is that, it is that element of the ANC in the 1950s, of the ANC Youth League, that gives the ANC an Africanist character. Now, this answers the question you posed earlier. At some point, the ANC appears to be Africanist, and other moments it becomes something completely different. At that point in the 1950s, it is when the ANC has got, quite, a substantial number of Africanists, inside it, and these are activists, and these are people who are holding very, important leadership positions, inside the ANC. And it is the Youth League, that influences the program of action. I know a lot of people talk about the program of action and the fact that it was a radicalization of the ANC without actually unpacking the kind of radicalism envisioned in the program of action. And that kind of radicalism was any kind of campaign that is going to be undertaken in the 1950s will have to adopt a kind of insurrection. It will have to be a kind of a mass insurrection. It doesn't matter what, but expectations, were that the decade of the 1950s will be the decade of not only mass mobilization, but mass insurrection. And this is what the Youth League was actually pushing for. And this was contrasting their vision of the 1950s with what the ANC had been historically until that moment. And if you remember, the ANC was writing letters. It was sending delegations, to Europe. And these people are saying, we mobilize the masses and we engage in a mass movement and mass insurrection. And that was agreed. It was agreed and it was adopted as a resolution in 1949. But 1950 comes immediately. That resolution is betrayed. It is betrayed, and this is in the view of the Africanists, the Youth League again, in the ANC. It is betrayed when the communists, are beginning to put pressure on the ANC and proposing that the ANC should participate with the masses in the upcoming May Day protest. Now, May Day is in fact, a day associated with the socialist, kind of dispensation, if you like, or paradigm. And from the very beginning, the Africanists inside the ANC are actually, religiously opposed, to Marxism-Leninism penetrating, the African National Congress and actually influencing its programs. And they're steadfast against, that. So they see May Day, as a celebration of, well, it becomes a celebration of the Workers' Day, but it is more associated with, a kind of a socialist stroke communist Marxist discourse. And it's on the basis of that, that they are rejecting the idea of celebrating May Day, on the 1st of May, 1950. But what makes the May Day of 1950 even more significant, it is that it is in 1950 that the Suppression of Communism Act, was passed by the apartheid state or by the white supremacy state. And this actually makes the SACP very popular. If it is banned, if there is a need to, pass the Suppression of Communism Act, then it means the SACP is relevant. And that makes it, but this is what happens on May Day in 1950. The Africanists are doing everything they can to disrupt the rallies, because they are unhappy about, the celebration of May Day and dragging African people, into these campaigns. Notably, the trio, Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and Oliver Tambo, are actually participating in the disruption of these rallies. At this stage, they are still, fully behind the Africanists. They are the Africanists as well. It is known, that on that day, the trio actually went to Nuclear. And Nuclear is very interesting. Nuclear is, it's a, if you like, it's a citadel of the Basotho-Russian gangs. But the Sotho miners too, Basotho working on the mines are concentrated, in Nuclear. But the SACP is also strong on the basis of the union, the African Mine Workers Union, which in 1946 staged a major strike. And again, Nuclear was at the center of that strike too. J.B. Marx is actually a resident of Nuclear, and he's in the middle of, of all of this. And yes, it is the Africanists who actually disrupt these, rallies. But the one in Nuclear was actually addressed by the ancestor of this Kachalia, who is Minister of Police. And the trio went to that particular, rally and disrupted it. The long and the short of it is that, the May Day protest did not receive as much support as was anticipated, by the ANC. So in 1951, they decided that Moroka, who was president at this time, had actually betrayed the Africanists, and they felt they are no longer going to support, his presidency.
So Moroka was not an Africanist?
He was, I should have explained this. In 1949, when they adopted the program of action, they wanted a president who was going to drive the program of action. You are right to ask whether he was not an Africanist. Eshbim Da, in fact, was very instrumental, in getting Moroka to be made the president. And he was very confident that they could be able to steer him in the right direction. They proved to be, quite mistaken about it because, and this is important to mention because this is what Soski actually talks about, a historian, Canadian historian who has written a PhD on the Indian contribution, in black struggles. He talks about the ways in which Yusuf Dadoo used his influence over J.S. Moroka to steer him, away from the Africanists. So it was, in fact, ANC's participation in the 1950 May Day protest is something that was orchestrated, literally orchestrated by Yusuf Dadoo. And this is by Soski's own admission. And Soski is an apologist, of Indian participation in black struggles. But he sees this as a good thing. He seems to understand Yusuf to be doing black people a favor. Yusuf is fighting our struggle. It's the kind of perception that, that Soski has.
May I just interject?
Yeah.
Just a little question. Would it be fair to say that Yusuf Dadoo at this point is really resisting the Black Republic in favor of the South African Republic?
Exactly. I mean, he is, no doubt. I mean, he is actually, if you think about it, I mean, by 1939, he's actually one of the leading members of the SACP, and he's actually wedded, to the idea I don't know, the two-stage theory at this stage, the idea that, you first need to have a kind of national independence, but that would not be the Black Republic thesis, yes, certainly not. But that's a question that, we probably will certainly have to revisit. But be that as it may, 1951, Dadu orchestrates. In 1950, he orchestrates and participation, but that leads to the dismissal, if you like, quite formally in a conference in 1951. J.S. Moroka is removed, and he's replaced by Chief Luthuli. Yes, and in 1951...
you still, though, I'm not satisfied with the answer about why white people hate communism so much and why it's like scary for them.
Let's finish the 1950s,
Okay.
and the answer will actually lie at the end of 1959. Yeah. So in 51 that happens. Moroka is unseated and Luthuli becomes the president. Now here is something that, Luthuli has actually been referred to, on a number of occasions very recently. He's been celebrated, he received the Nobel Prize, and he's been given a kind of, character that suggests, that he was a kind of a radical of sorts. But actually throughout the 1950s, the ANC actually deviates from the Africanist path under Luthuli's watch. And the issue here, and I'm saying this not as a political activist, but, looking at the available archival, kind of evidence that's there, that's confronting us. In actual fact, throughout the 1950s, the most influential person inside the ANC, even though he was not a member of the ANC, was actually Yusuf Dadoo, much more than Luthuli himself. We go into 1952. Luthuli, this is his first opportunity as president. The ANC decides on the defiance campaign. Again here, there has been a great deal of, embellishing the facts about the defiance campaign. And this is where, elements of Africanism and non-Africanism actually play against each other, within the ANC. And you see it in the defiance campaign of 1952. There are discussions going on inside the ANC planning the defiance campaign of 1952. And quite clearly at this stage, the Indian communities are seen as part of this, judging from what actually happened in the May Day protests. I mean, Indian communities were taking part. So it is expected, that Indians are going to be participating in the defiance campaign. But there's concern in the Indian communities, over the upcoming defiance campaign. Their concern is that if it is going to follow, the vision of the Africanists and the program of action, there's going to be mass insurrection. And if the Indians are going to be associated with it, this will muddy the waters for them in colonial society. They did not want to affront the sensibilities of the, of the white supremacists. They will see them in a bad light and, and cast them in the same mold as the natives, as into the native sphere, actually. And that's the fear of the Indian society, not to descend into the native sphere. There has to be the distinction between the Indians and the native sphere, and that has always been the case historically. A descendant of Mahatma Gandhi, Manilal Gandhi, actually talks about this with Indians in meetings, in formal meetings, informal gatherings, raising concerns about the upcoming defense campaign. And he's saying black people are so impressionable, that you cannot rely on them to behave, properly. And that the Indians are only going to, undermine their own position within colonial society, that they shouldn't participate in this thing. That was a genuine concern for the Indians, because there were Indian movements that were not communist or radical. And, it is these movements that were calling for caution, not, to have Indian politics being radicalized, in that way. So Dadu proposes that a committee be formed, to take decisions on what form the defiance campaign would take. Would it be a mass insurrection or would it be passive resistance? Now, the suggestion was that each ethnic group, not quite each racial group, if you like, the Indians, black people, coloreds, and whites, should have one representative. But that didn't go down well with the Africanists, that, because Africans are numerically more than the other three, they should have, an overrepresentation, if you may call it an overrepresentation. But in the end, what happened is that the 1952 defense campaign was actually put out as a defiance campaign, turn the other cheek. Now, it was no different from Satyagraha of Mahatma Gandhi. And quite clearly what was happening here is that Yusuf Dadu had the upper hand, and it was the ways in which he wanted it. Now, here in Johannesburg, you did have the defiance of apartheid laws. Mandela was one of, the chief volunteers, or one of the volunteers in chief. Now, again here, let's be careful. Remember, Mandela and the trio were responsible for disrupting, the May Day protests, because they were Africanists at the time. But in 1951, Mandela had a rethink, and it appears that this also rubbed on to the other two. But he had a rethink about the Indians, and he started, talking about Indians, particularly in Natal, also being, of the working class stock. And therefore, Indians could be seen as an important part, of the struggle against colonialism or anti-colonial struggle. And there was a shift. And at that point, the trio then became part of the mainstream ANC. But you still had the Africanists outside the ANC, who were inside the ANC, but not part of the mainstream. And one of them was Slopetema. And Slopetema is the first one to comment on the defiance campaign. And he talked about the ways in which non-Africans actually hijacked what would have been a program of action agenda and turned it into a Gandhi type, kind of resistance, and showing that Africans are losing control of decision-making processes, inside the ANC. It was quite a scathing article that he wrote in Bantu World as an editor of the Bantu World. Now, the ANC called upon him to retract, and he said no, and he was expelled. Now, Selbin Sima was an executive member of Natal ANC, and an Africanist as well. And Natal, in fact, the Natal ANC was not so much part of the mainstream. You had quite a great deal of, Africanist influence in the Natal ANC, as you did, in the Cape ANC, at the time when it was led by James Tayele, who was also became a member, an associate of the Gaviite movement in the Cape. But here in the Transvaal, with Luthuli being president of the overall ANC, Luthuli himself actually became volunteer-in-chief in Germiston, and he led a group of 50 people defying apartheid laws. And that's how disciplined it was. A good number of people that can be controlled, defying apartheid laws, for instance, walking into the whites-only section of Park Station, Johannesburg Station, getting themselves arrested, putting up bail and waiting for trial. And that's the way they were going about it. That's how the defiance campaign actually unfolded, in Johannesburg. In Durban, there were a few incidents where, a few Indians went out into the streets and, danced and, protested, and they were taken into custody. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they were out on bail and they were singing songs, and that was the end of it. But the Eastern Cape was different. In the Eastern Cape, there were skirmishes between white civilians and Africans, who were prepared. Now, this was a mini, mass insurrection that they actually staged. And there were fatalities, particularly in Port Elizabeth. There was one white person, who actually lost their lives during the skirmishes. And the ANC got terribly uneasy about this. But the worst part was in East London, in Duncan Village. Here, the mass was actually moving into town as part of the defense campaign, but they were blocked by the police and pushed back into the village or into the township. But along the way, they encountered a nun who had been working in Duncan Village for years, someone they were familiar with, Sister Aidan. But the anger of the masses got the better of them. They brutally, attacked her, assaulted her, pelted her with stones, and they murdered her. But her body was never found. It was never recovered. To this day, it is not known what actually happened. Part of what one is seeing here is the violence, that can only be explained in one way, that it is the violence that the ANC was avoiding because of its moderation. But it is a violence that Africanists within the ANC may want to talk about, may rather want to explain and have a discussion about it, which is why I always think that black radicalism has a component of violence about it. This is something that needs to be talked about rather than to be condemned outright. But that's the sense. The sense is that violence is actually, generally it is accepted that violence is actually the preserve of the oppressor because of his, he lacks ethical validity. It's ethical bankruptcy when you become violent. And that becomes quite difficult for the black radical tradition, to deal with. So that whenever you become violent, there's that kind of condemnation that comes. But that is what happened in Duncan Village. Sister Aidan was brutally murdered. Her body was never recovered. Now the ANC, others would say, got cold feet and decided to suspend the defense campaign. Interestingly, there was a body in Transkei at the time. It was called the Transkei Organized Bodies. It was a political movement that was made up of other political parties, including the Non-European Unity Movement, the African People's Democratic Union of South Africa, ABDUSA, and members of the ANC. Interestingly, in 1953, its president was Govan Mbeki, and after the ANC suspended the defense campaign, Govan Mbeki went to Transkei on a visit, and a meeting was actually called by the TOB, the Transkeian Organized Bodies. And the issue here was the way the ANC handled the defense campaign. I.B. Tabata at the time was of the Non-European Unity Movement, but also a member of TOB, and proposed that Govan Mbeki be unseated as president of TOB. And I.B. Tabata actually became president of TOB because they condemned the way in which the ANC dealt with the defense campaign in 1952. I explained the Bantu Education Act in 1953. The most important thing here, we've seen the 1920s movement. We've seen that one of the things that was pretty close to their hearts was establishing their own independent schools. So when Bantu Education Act was enacted, here was an opportunity to take children away from government schools into independent schools. In Orlando, you are talking about people who came from across the Transkei, for instance, who could relate quite easily to establishing, running, and managing independent schools. Yeah, but these communities, would have been in a position to, establish independent schools. But because it was not, rooted in the masses, the campaign actually failed. Within 3 to 4 weeks of it having started, parents were taking their children back to government schools, and the whole anti-Bantu education campaign actually collapsed. this was another indication that the ANC was not actually rooted in the masses. And remember, this is in the 1950s. And this is the decade when the ANC is supposed to be, a mass movement. Now, 1955 is the Sophiatown matter. And again here, Sophiatown looked up to the ANC. But again, by February 1955, you had, bulldozers coming into Sophiatown, and Sophiatown was destroyed. So the attempt to stop the destruction of Sophiatown actually collapsed. But if you think about it, Sophiatown was absolutely important for a number of reasons. The most important, being that it was the last opportunity for black people to have property rights in the urban areas. If that was taken away, no other place in the urban areas would black people enjoy any property rights. But the ANC failed, to come to the party on that as well. Now, 1955 is actually, again, in June 1955, it is the Freedom Charter. Now, here, we talked about the Freedom Charter, and we've shown that the Freedom Charter could not be seen, as responding to the concerns of the masses. We go back to the 1920s, Ama Israeli, the Wellingtonian movement, Ama Felan Daonye, Prophetess Nonteta. All of those were movements that were concerned about the availability of land to black people. And all of those were well thought out, political programs by that movement, by the mass movement, of the period. The Freedom Charter is adopted. The Freedom Charter is not reflecting in any way that historical experience, of black people of the 20 years between 1919 and 1939. It is not reflecting that, that concern at all, showing the extent to which, the ANC was detached, from the masses. The Freedom Charter is not saying anything whatsoever, about the historical struggles, that had been going on, during the 20th century, leading up to its adoption in 1955. We may not look at the entire Freedom Charter, but it has a clause, which seems to be the foundational clause of the Freedom Charter. And this is a clause that the ANC always refers to in terms of, how the land question is going to be dealt with. That's the clause that says land will be shared equally among those who work it. I don't know how many people understand the meaning of that clause in terms of the political context in which the Freedom Charter was adopted. When the Freedom Charter is adopted in 1955, one has to be looking at the relationship that different segments of African society has with the land. Now, there is a 13% land that made up the native reserves, which by 1955 had actually become the Bantustans. Now, that is the 13% that was allocated to black people. The rest of the 87% is white South Africa. And that would have been the case until 1955. In 1955, when the Freedom Charter is adopted, that is the situation in South Africa. 87% of white South African land mass actually belongs to white people. But there are different segments of black people either working on the land under different types of contracts and relationships to the land. In the Western Cape, it's got its own specificity. It's got to do with, if you think about the wine farming industry, it's got its own specific relationship. African people are either labor tenants or they are just downright workers, or even worse. They, in some cases, reduced to the state of actually serfdom. They become serfs, in the rural areas. But the one area that we should be looking at is the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, because that's the most important area where issues and contestations about land, become more pronounced, because it is a commercial area. Those are the areas where commercial agriculture is particularly vibrant, during this period. Now, the issue here is that what the ANC is thinking about, land will be shared equally among those who work it. It is still assuming that you have a certain degree of independent African producers working on the land. And this is not the case. By 1955, African independent producers have been pushed off that land, not by political instruments, such as the Land Act of 1913, but they were being progressively pushed off the land by mechanization. It is the tractor, it is the thresher, it is all mechanization of agricultural operations that are pushing Africans off the land. By 1955, Africans working the land, working the land for their own benefit, would be those in the 13% of the Bantustans. But other Africans are working for white commercial agricultural enterprises. By 1955, it is the Boer and his tractor that are working the land. It is not African people. So that clause is completely misplaced in terms of what the history is at that point, what the relationship between different segments of African society and the land would have been. But then the land, South Africa belongs to all who live it. It just does not make sense. Yeah.
Wow.
But again, it's another indication of the ANC veering away, from the black radical tradition. Then in 1956, they adopt their own constitution, which is modeled around the Freedom Charter, and we know what that is. And in 58, the Africanists. Now, the Africanists who have been throughout the decade giving the ANC its mass character. It is the Africanists who were giving the ANC its mass character. You take the Africanists out of the ANC, it is deprived of its mass character. That's a historical fact. They move away in 58, they form the PAC in 59, they stage a major mass campaign in 1950, the anti-pass campaign. The masses respond, and this is quite clearly, the masses respond to the language they can relate to, and that's the language of the Africanists. That's the language of Robert Sobukwe. That's the language of Ashbin Dar. But there's another issue here about passes which needs to be explained, and people don't seem to understand the structural imperatives of passes at this time. What does it mean? What does it mean if you frequently fall foul of the pass laws? What it actually means is that progressively you are being directed to a Bantustan. You are being directed, it is no longer native reserve, it is Bantustans. Now, the issue here is that the offenders are being targeted as individuals. They are not being targeted as a group. You get arrested for a pass offense at the station as an individual. So we have to really appreciate, the ability of Robert Sobukwe to actually mobilize, a mass of people around the pass, when in fact the victims are actually individuals. Other people could have said, but my pass is in good order, and but he managed that, and it certainly became, an issue of national importance. But that led to, to the Sharpeville massacre, in 1960. But there's reaction to the Sharpeville massacre, and it is a reaction of condemnation mainly, particularly from again, we've been talking about I.B. Tabata. I.B. Tabata was also very, critical of the PAC for having staged the anti-pass campaign that led to the march. He saw it as a kind of, as being opportunistic, on the part of the PAC. And his insistence was that in actual fact, the struggle is against, a kind of a political economy here. It is a struggle against capitalist capitalist domination of society, and that this, forms of struggle should actually be able, to address that thing. And he said, it is the bourgeois white society that is in fact, the enemy here. And you get a sense that, this is a kind of person who would subscribe to the view that the white working class can be incorporated into, a kind of a rebel. But it's understandable. It is in the context, of the time. And these are people who are committed, to the idea of world capitalist system, that capitalism is a world system. It's a global system, and it has to be confronted as such. But as for the ANC, their condemnation of Sharpeville is that it was their program, and this is what they say: we planned this thing, but we wanted to do it 10 days later, on the 31st of March. And it was opportunistic of the PAC to stage it 10 days before. But the reality here is that it is not us claiming. We have shown that from 1950 right down to 1959, the ANC was veering away from the concerns of the masses, that where it appeared that the ANC was a mass movement, it was when the Africanists were in it. Now let's come to the question, white society and communism. Now, at the end of the 1950s, and again this is only reaffirms what we've just said. At the end of the 1950s, political organizations are reflecting on the decade as a whole and saying this is how the 1950s looked like. One of those reflections came from an organization that was called the Congress of Democrats. Now, that was an organization of white communists who were also members of the SACP. And Joe Slovo was, in fact, a member of the Joe Slovo, Ruth First, Rusty Bernstein. They were members of the SACP, but they were members of the Congress of Democrats. When the Congress Alliance was established in 1953, it was the Congress of Democrats of white people, the Indian Congresses, the colored political organization, and the ANC. It became the Congress Alliance. So the Congress of Democrats was a white political organization, but it had communists in it, the SACP. Now, on reflecting on the decade, Joe Slovo wrote in the Congress of Democrats newsletter, reflecting on the decade, and he said since 1948, white society had been moving away from liberal politics to conservative politics to the Nationalist Party. The Nationalist Party had been increasing its support since 1948, and it was clear the statistics were there, the figures were there. In 1953, they had an increase from 48 to 53, the first election. Now, in 58, the second election, it was even near a landslide. So white society was coalescing around the Nationalist Party. And that was of major concern, to Joe Slovo and the communists. Now, it may well be that, yes, indeed, white society would have been more concerned, about the impact of communism. This is why they would have rather, moved to the right and actually even abandon the liberal politics in the center and actually go to the right wing, to the Nationalist Party. So that by 58, it was a massive vote. This is what Joe Slovo was saying, that white society, it is regrettable that white society is moving to the right, to the National Party. But he said, we are taking cold comfort in the fact that we in the Congress Alliance have managed to ensure, to put a brake, to ensure that black politics do not move in the other extreme. So you wonder what Joe Slovo is actually thinking here. But what in fact he is saying is that their presence inside the ANC made certain that the ANC is not going to move in the other extreme, which is the Africanist extreme. So the question is, was the ANC a mass movement and radical in the 1950s? The answer is no. But I said it is in fact academics of the white left constructing this narrative in the immediate aftermath of Black Wednesday. This is important. This narrative that the ANC was a mass movement in the 1950s is being constructed in the immediate aftermath of Black Wednesday. The issue here, the objective, is to undermine the black mass movement of the 1970s as much as it is possible. That's the first thing. The second thing is to want to suggest that the mass movement of the 1970s is a mere continuation of the mass movement of the 1950s. If the 1950s was an ANC decade and the mass movement was that of the ANC, of course, then the mass movement of the 1970s was also inspired by the ANC. But how do they sustain that kind of an argument? They introduce a theme here, the ANC underground. So the mass movement of the 1970s is the work of the ANC underground, creating this critical mass for the June 1976-77 uprising. And this is the work that is being done by white radicals, by the white left in the academic, kind of setup. And this is the concern because, even in certain black consciousness circles, people don't seem to grasp this, that it is the white left that was beginning to, write the narrative, the historical narrative of the liberation struggle. But it is also the white left that was then beginning to set the agenda, for the mass movement of the 1980s. And, it became that sort of a continuation. And I'm reminded by, the interview that you had with Bramandla, because I thought there was a particular historical moment that Bramandla actually overlooked. And it also happens within this context. He pointed out at the fact that there are three sides of struggle here, correctly. It's the universities, TEFLO, the Tiro testimonies, the Tiro speech. The universities become a site of struggle. He also mentioned the fact that SASO established SASM, South African Students' Movement. And this is a movement in the high schools. So the high schools become another terrain of struggle. And then you have the BPC established in 1972. It then, looks at the adult population, if you like, professionals, the churches, and then it becomes a national mass movement. That's how the black consciousness movement becomes, a national mass movement. But here is something, and this is, I can assure you, I can understand why Bramandla hasn't actually looked at SASM in those terms. But this is what SASM actually, happened to SASM. No doubt it was a creation of the black consciousness movement. But it is SASM that opened the door for the ANC underground. In Soweto, it did that. It opened the door for what would become the ANC underground in the making of the 1970s mass movement. It is members of SASM, who wanted to insist on relationships being established, with the ANC underground. A good example here, you can think of Tokyo and the other, 11 people who went on the Pretoria trial. They were actually, if you like, proteges of Joe Gabi. Joe Gabi was, in fact, a stalwart of the ANC who served 10 years on Robben Island. He comes out in 1974, and it is around him that the ANC underground is actually being created. Another is John Nkadimeng, who also comes out of jail out of Robben Island in 1974. And he too becomes a part of that Enk underground. The third is a guy called Henry Makgoti. He too is of that stock. So these students, some of them are in fact were students a year before, 73, 74, are older but not in jobs. And they gather around youth clubs at this time. And they are attracted to Joe Gabi, and he gets them into the ANC. That's how Tokyo and the others got into it. But then going into 1976, you still have a group of students, who are in SASM and who see themselves as part of the ANC underground. Just to name a few: Super Mofokeng, Rola Masinga, Mefi Morobe himself, Billy Maseka. These are members of SASM, but at the same time, they have this relationship with the ANC underground. So after the 16th of June, because they are already known to the security police, they would be targeted. So some of them actually go underground, not to leave the country, but they go to the, to the Bundus, to the, Bantustans, if they have relatives there, just to cool off a little. And this comes out clear in the interview that was done by Billy Maseka with Spisongove in the book The Road to Democracy. And this is Billy Maseka explaining this. But he was a member of SASM at the time. And he was in Soweto in 76, on the 16th of June. But they had to leave. Remember, between the 16th of June and the 4th of August, there was a lot of that uncertainty. But it is during that period, that some students were already, creating a distance between themselves and the ANC underground. And these are the students who would form the Soweto Students Representative Council. Students like Tsietsi Mashineni, Khotso Seakholo, Tsietsi Maleho, A.B. Lebelo, my brother actually. These are people who became, the leadership in the SSRC. Izikluwe too, quite important. But were not part of that ANC underground. And on the other, you had those that I mentioned, and you add Sichaba Munziti onto those. Those were somehow still connected to the ANC underground. So when the SSRC is formed on the 2nd of August 1976, the people who do so are the people who are decidedly not part of the ANC. And I thought, Bramandla could have explained that, because what is important is that Billy Maseka, in 1979, becomes very active in the creation of COSAS. So the unfortunate part, and I know this is a controversial statement, particularly to black consciousness adherents, this is a statement that I make, that the unfortunate thing about SASM is that it evolved into COSAS. SASM actually evolved into COSAS and actually became an affiliate of Congolese, because if one traces Billy Maseka's development, and even that of Mefi Morobe, Mefi Morobe comes out of Robben Island and he's very active in the UDF. He's past becoming a student. But they get to be in the Congolese tradition, which is why my sense is that a closer look at SASM will show that it was actually being used, to sustain this kind of a contrived narrative, about the ANC having been, very instrumental in the making of the 1976 or the 1970s, mass movement. That's the one thing. The other that Bramandla referred to was the Kabwe conference, and he's definitely right about that. The Tambo speech in the Kabwe conference. And I thought I should remind you that at some point, when we dealt with this thing, we dealt with the Vienna uprising. Now, what Tambo was saying in the Kabwe conference was affirming what they did as a reaction to the Vienna uprising. Remember, the Vienna uprising came about as a result, first, of the Amatola raid, in Mozambique. And the people who were blamed for having betrayed the movement were the black consciousness recruits, that they got out of the 1976, movement. They blamed them for being spies. And for the next 2 years, 81 to 83, they were on a witch hunt, of these guys. But 1984, in May to August 1984, in actual fact, executions actually happened. Public executions of about 7 people who were put on tribunal, found guilty, and executed. Now, I think part of what we are seeing here is that, no doubt, the white supremacy state played a very important role, in obliterating the black radical tradition, particularly in its last phase, the black consciousness movement. But equally so, the white radical left, just from their intellectual pursuits, were determined, to rewrite the history of the 1950s, and in the process, make insinuations about the character of the liberation struggle in the 1970s, attempting to, extricate the black radical content of the mass movement of the 1970s. Another issue that, I thought Bramandla could have handled, but maybe at a later stage you will come back to these and talk about them. He spoke quite at length, about Neville Alexander, and his role in the 1980s. The one thing that I thought, he overlooked was a very important conference in 1982, the Azapo Conference of 1982. It was Azapo's 9th General Conference. It was held in Hammanskraal at St. Peter's Seminary.
Steve, do you think we can take this into the next episode?
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. That these are issues that we are going to have to deal with.
Yes.
But like just in terms of our timeline, just in terms of our timeline, we are at 60. Yes. Because important period is 60 to 75. There's an important thing there. Still, we're answering the question, white people and communism. Yes. And Lebelo actually shows quite clearly, that in white society there was that understanding, that the Congress Alliance is about communism. And the only people who can, protect us from that is the Nationalist Party, which is pretty much what actually happened.
Why are they fearing communism? What is it that is threatening them about it?
This has to do with the Bolshevik takeover, in the Soviet Union, and it also has to do with the impact of, American foreign policy and American sensibilities, which would filter, through to the wide world across, globally. The issue here is that the fear of communism was accentuated in the post-Second World War period. When, there's a saying that there's a communist under every bed. In the U.S., there was a witch hunt, for communists, and that tended to affect white society, also including in South Africa. And the most important thing, next time when we get together, we will see. What you are contrasting here is communism, which is on the extreme left of the political spectrum. But during this period, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, it was contrasted with what? With fascism, Nazism. So on the one extreme, you have communism, which is feared by white society, particularly because white society is capitalist inclined. And what they see is communism is a threat to capitalism. So that's the biggest problem that they have with it. But in South Africa, if you get to the 1970s, particularly with P.W. Botha, at that stage, this is important. In the 50s, there may have been that fear, that morbid fear for communism. By 1979, 1980, white society had come to appreciate the fact that if communism was going to displace capitalism, it would have to be through armed struggle, waged by MK. And this is their understanding by 1979, 1980, that MK and the ANC and the Congress, let's sum it up in one line. What did they think of this? They thought of it as a ferocious looking balloon inflated by propaganda. That was white society's understanding of MK and the Congress Alliance, that they were a ferocious looking balloon inflated and bloated by propaganda. What they are saying is that what the ANC was saying about armed propaganda, they are only a kind of a ferocious looking balloon, and there's nothing to them. So there was no fear in white society of a kind of MK overthrow of the state and instituting a socialist communist dispensation. By the 1970s, white society in South Africa does not have that fear at all. What white society fears is the black radical mass movement of the 1970s. And what they are hoping for is to have a strong government that will be able to contain the Swart Gevaar, not the Rooi Gevaar. For them, the Rooi, in actual fact, so many people came back and told them that, that's what the Congress is, a ferocious looking balloon inflated by propaganda. White people did not fear a communist takeover in South Africa. Not even the Afrikaner, had that fear, because they knew this. They knew that, this is what they have to fear was another insurrection, mass insurrection that would be inspired by the black radical tradition. But here's the historical fact. The black radical tradition was an unbreakable thread from 1918 to 77. October 1977, Black Wednesday, marked the end of the black radical tradition as an instrument of mass mobilization. The mass mobilization of the 1980s was actually weaponized against the black radical tradition. That is what Ramandla was telling you, that in actual fact, that mass democratic movement was weaponized against black consciousness, against black radicalism.